Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. The hammer is falling on Putin's regime, swinging against the oil revenues that support the system and his illegal war. The first cracks are showing in Moscow's facade as oil is targeted and the main buyers, China and India, blink. Putin says that the sanctions are serious but will not affect his regime. He's lying, and he immediately dispatched a Kremlin minion, an apparent deal maker to the US, to advocate for lifting the sanctions. See the problem with the logic? Please remove these sanctions that are having no effect on us. It simply makes no sense at all. What else is happening? Well, Russia's fourth largest refinery goes dark after Ukrainian strike. We'll also look at fresh data on desertions from the Russian army, Russia's creeping mobilization by stealth, the hybrid war that is escalating against Europe, and what frontline commanders say about the next phase of drone warfare. Let's jump into today's top stories. US EU sanctions are going straight for Russia's oil cash flow. Washington unveiled its consequential package, its most consequential package since 2022, directly designating Rosneft and Lukoil and dozens of subsidiaries under EO 14024. OFAC's line is completely unambiguous. All entities owned 50% or more, directly or indirectly by Rosneft and Lukoil, are blocked. That's from a US Treasury press release, October 22nd, 2025. This landed alongside the EU's 19th package of sanctions, a phased ban on Russian LNG at EU ports, new measures against enablers, and tighter controls on circumvention. Why does all this matter? Well, hitting revenues is critical. Oil and petroleum taxes are the Kremlin's fiscal oxygen. Analysts and former officials say that enforcement and secondary sanctions now determine whether this becomes decisive. This can't just be a one and done, said Edward Fishman of the US Treasury. Global prices reacted. Brent jumped 5% on the headlines before easing as traders gauged the enforcement credibility and scale of the announced sanctions and its hit on the global supply. That's from The Guardian. The US Treasury framed the moral angle behind the sanctions. Now is the time to stop the killing, as it targeted Russia's primary revenue source. That's from the Treasury statement, October 22nd. Of course, the phrase stop the killing is not as moral as it appears, or at least it is minimally moral, because it contains no then what, no implications of justice and restitution, no suggestion of the restoration of stolen lands and return to sovereign borders, and indeed return of the stolen children. But in any case, it aligns with the approach of Zelensky, at least as a first step, which is to implement a ceasefire without conditions. So what's the reaction? Well, Beijing blinks, Delhi hedges, and buyers are pulling back from Russian crude. Within 24 to 48 hours, Chinese state majors PetroChina, Sinopec, CNOOC, and Xinhua suspended seaborne Russian oil purchases. Indian refiners signaled sharp cuts, with Reliance publicly saying it would abide by Western sanctions. This is all re-reported via a Reuters and their company statements. China's small teapot refiners may keep some of the flow going below the radar, and Russia's shadow fleet will chase workarounds for sure. But losing state-backed buyers at scale is a sudden shock to Moscow's export machine and to the grey fleet ecosystem that surrounds it. That's according to Reuters. Putin conceded that the measures may cause some losses, while insisting Russia will never bow to pressure. So, is it being met with calm repose in the Kremlin? Are they not worried? Oh, yes. Yes, they are definitely worried. The panic is setting in. Consequences of Putin's illegal war are unnerving the regime and those around it. So, at what position is the panic meter? The Kremlin's money whisperer turns up in the US almost immediately. Kirill Dmitriev, the man who looks a little like a baked potato who's been left out of the fridge for several weeks, head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, and special envoy for economic cooperation flew to the US for talks just days after the sanctions hit, as per the Moscow Times, citing CNN and Axios. That's from the Moscow Times, they say. The context: Dmitriev was formally appointed a special envoy in February with a portfolio that explicitly includes ties with the US. Again, that's from Reuters. Let's explain the tactic here. Why send him and not a senior diplomat or minister? It's because Russia understands that the way to get Trump's attention is to dangle potential deals in his face. Mineral deals, infrastructure deals, trading deals, anything. It doesn't matter how absurd and unrealistic they actually are, such as the bridge or tunnel between the US and Russia, a potentially vast project sited where no one lives and in a place no one really wants to travel between. A giant white elephant, of course, but the tactic is this. The Kremlin says that if you impose sanctions, we'll have to pause this project, this shiny thing, this bauble that was never going to happen anyway. Let's now turn to damage to the war economy. Refineries and gas plants hit. And amidst the crisis diplomacy, Ukraine's long-range campaign keeps grinding. Russia's fourth largest refinery at Ryazan halted a key crude unit after a drone-induced fire this week, cutting the throughput. The AVT4 crude distillation unit was urgently halted on October 22nd, reported outlets summarizing Reuters' sourcing. Kiev Independent updated the shutdown on October 25th and confirmed the scale of it. Earlier this week, a Ukrainian strike on the Orenburg gas processing plant forced a halt in Kazakh gas intake and a production cut at the giant Karachaganak field, a cross-border effect. Well, these aren't pinpricks, but giant haymaker blows, and they keep on landing directly on Russia's revenues. Refineries and gas processing underpin domestic fuel availability, price stability, and of course, critically, military logistics. And the refinery map Ukraine is hitting is deep, deep in Russia's rear. Well, Reuters' tally of this is that so far this year, 29 refinery strikes have hit European Russia. Let's turn now to some of the other stories, including the frontline snapshot where the fighting is hottest. This weekend's ISW update flags continued Russian pressure along the Pokrovsk axis and sporadic gains under heavy losses, with Ukrainian localized counterattacks and interdiction strikes in depth. That's from ISW Daily Assessments, 22nd to 24th of October. Russia maintains tempo, but is having minimal gains. Ukraine targets logistics and fuel, and the drone strike war is increasingly shaping the ground fight. There is also concerned speculation that Ukraine is thin in many places due to lack of deployed and experienced infantry. And these are issues that the government seems unable to address over the last 1 to 2 years. But Russia also has a problem, not only in mobilization of fit and experienced men, but in retaining them. Desertions and discipline, the scale of the problem. Well, of course, hard numbers are tricky to find, both by design and circumstance, but independent tallies are stark and highly suggestive. 20,662 criminal cases for refusing service were in Russian military courts by the end of May. That's according to Media Zona, and that was reported on June 26th. Investigations and reporting point to tens of thousands of desertions from the Russian army overall since 2022. That's from iStories, and based on figures cited by the Moscow Times, they say at least 50,000 soldiers have fled. Medusa's latest dive into this story notes that prosecutors often punt first offences back to units, an attritional coercive churn rather than a clean adjustment. So they prefer to send people back into the fray rather than prison. Well, that makes sense, because for the Defense Ministry of Russia, people are garbage. That's a Medusa headline that framed the system and its attitude bluntly on October 8th. But the garbage is walking. trying to get away from the meat grinder lines, even if many are recycled back under duress. The scale of this signals a regime risk over time, and a significant one. So, what is Moscow doing? Well, this is the next story: mobilization by stealth, the legal screws tighten. Moscow is moving to expand active reserve call-ups and year-round conscription mechanics without declaring a fresh wave of partial mobilization. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and others tracked new amendments enabling deployment of reservists abroad. That's the key point here. Many who are reservists may expect to be positioned on the home front. That is not necessarily the case. ISW frames it as a rolling mobilization to sustain the campaign in Europe. It's the Kremlin's way to raise troop levels without the political blast radius of a formal mobilization decree, but the social and economic drag still accumulates. Of course, the regime are terrified of a repeat of the mass exodus of fighting-age males from Russia in 22-23, when the first round of mobilization threatened. Some people returned to the major cities as the regime signaled that they'd have some immunity from mobilization and instead focused on ethnic minorities and impoverished people, especially in the provinces. Well, let's have a quick rundown of a few other stories that I think are important and breaking over the last couple of days. One is hybrid pressure on Europe, balloons, GPS jamming, and there's a sort of theatre of Russian sabotage. Lithuania twice shut down Vilnius airport and tightened its Belarus border after waves of suspicious balloons were spotted. It is a classic low-cost, high-disruption play layered onto the chronic GPS interference that is being experienced and has been for many years in the Baltic region. That's from Guardian and Reuters. Then we have an interesting comment here about drone warfare 2.0 and the adaptation race. Reuters spoke with a Ukrainian drone commander who described a rapid cat and mouse of innovation and evolution of battlefield tech. Russian EW evolves, Ukraine iterates some more autonomy and guidance and improved systems and swarm tactics to punch through. Innovation cycles are now measured in weeks, not months and years. Well, that was reported in October on the 24th. And lastly, let's turn to Europe's money and munitions towards harder levers over Russia and, of course, its own defence. In London, Keir Starmer hosted a milli coalition with Zelensky and EU leaders vowing to squeeze Russian oil and gas out of markets and fast-track the use of frozen Russian assets. Ukraine's future is our future, Starmer said, and that's from a October 24th live report in The Guardian. In Brussels, leaders debated the legal plumbing to channel windfall proceeds to collateralize support, a necessary complement to sanctions and the price cap regime. Unfortunately, a final decision on that has been bumped towards the end of the year, which is a disappointment, but it does seem that the political mood is swinging very much behind using those Russian central bank assets to plug the gaps in Ukraine's budget and, of course, for its defense requirements. Russian central bank cut its key rate, base rate, 50 base points to 16.5%, even as the sanctions clouds gather. It is a symbolic move that will not fix the structural constraints from the fuel shocks and the tightening labour market in Russia. That's according to Reuters. The UK-EU shadow fleet crackdown earlier this year now has sharper teeth when combined with the US move on Rosneft and Lukoil. Ports, insurers and banks face real secondary risks. Well, let's conclude. Sanctions only bite if they are enforced and the gaps are plugged. And this week, enforcement started to look real, perhaps for the first time in 4 years of war. I mean, that in itself is a disgrace, but at least it is coming finally. Now, China's state refiners stepping back is a concrete sign of that change. And Ukraine's refinery strike campaign keeps turning military initiative into economic pain for Russia. Russia's answer is the same as ever: coerce more bodies to the front and hope that the system holds. But the foundations of the regime are starting to crumble, and we'll watch out over the coming weeks as panic builds in the regime among its dependents and cheerleaders, but also within the Siloviki and the broader public.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kiev of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kiev of Mine is a fast paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kiev of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kiev of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.